So good day everyone. I am Kian Lao, and for today I will going to discuss the land ownership in the Philippines under Spain. So I'm going to give a short review about the policies on agrarian reform. So agrarian reform refers to the ratification of the entire agricultural system. This is an important issue because nearly half of the population is employed in agricultural sector and most Filipinos lived in rural areas. It mainly focuses on the Philippines between production and the distribution of land among farmers. So we all know that here in the Philippines, we have a many fertile lands and a large number of farmers working to cultivate them. In fact, the Philippines is known as a good exporter of agricultural products, though a genuine and a comprehensive agrarian reform, the country can fully maximize its agricultural potential. To be better understand the agrarian reform in the Philippines, we need to look at our history, especially our colonial past, because that is where we find the roots of the agrarian issues and that we still experience today. So, as for my main topic, we're going to discuss, as I said, the land ownership in the Philippines under Spain. So, as we understand the agrarian reform, we also need to go back in the time and look at the land ownership in the Philippines before the Spanish arrived. So, we must remember that even before colonization, the Philippines was already a civilized country. Filipinos lived in villages or some what we call barangays ruled by Datu. So the Datu made up the nobility, followed by the Maharlika, and then the Aliping Mamamahay, and the Alipin sa gigilid. That despite of the social structure, everyone had access to the fruits of the soil. So basically, before the Spaniards came, Filipinos had free access to land without needing the approval of many foreign colonizer. So Spanish colonization introduced major changes to the land ownership in the Philippines. So these include the Pueblo agriculture, encomienda system, and hacienda system. So the imposition of Spanish authority led to the creation of the system that governed the land ownership, starting with the Pueblo agriculture. Under this system, rural communities were organized and pueblos, where each family was given 4 to 5 hectares of the land to cultivate. But even Filipinos were assigned in some land, ownership remained with the King of the Spain. Filipinos were also forced to pay colonial tribute in the form of agricultural products. In this system, Filipino became strangers in their own land. They were only landholders, but not the true landowners. So next is the law of Indies. So the law of Indies was a collection of laws issued by the Spanish crown for its colonies in the Americas and the Philippines. And these laws regulated the social, political, and economic life of the people in these colonized lands. So, ito ang mga batas na namamahala sa social, political, and economic life ng mga Pilipino noong panahong sakop pa tayo ng Espanya. The Spanish crown awarded large tracts of land to three main groups, like ito law. So, the religious orders, repartimiento system, and the Spanish encomenderos. So the religious orders, they were given land to build churches and missions. So ang repartimiento system is lands were given as a reward to Spanish soldiers and military men for their service. So Spanish encomenderos, these were the colonizers given land under the encomienda system. So under the encomienda, they were tasked to manage the land and collect tribute from Filipino people, and this was the beginning of land system where the real owners were foreigners and Filipinos had to pay to work on what once was their own land. So the encomienda system was a deeply unfair and abusive setup introduced during Spanish colonization, known as compras y vandalas. Filipino farmers were forced to sell their produce at an extreme low price, surrender them entirely to the encomenderos. These encomenderos would then resell the goods for a profit. So, ginabaligyan nila to mas better price. But the exploitation didn't stop there. Filipinos living under the encomenda were also required to render service that had nothing to do with farming. For example, ani is the forced labor, pinapatrabaho sila in construction, and ginatagan sila mga household tasks or outside silang livelihoods and often degrading. So later on, in 19th century, the Spanish introduced another system. This is the system called the Hacienda system. This was a large-scale agricultural state also used across colonial Latin America. In the Philippines, it meant that huge tracts of land were controlled by wealthy landowners called hacienderos. As a result, countless peasant families, many of whom did live and work on the land for generation, were driven out or forced to work under the new authority of the new legal owners. So these title holders gained control simply because they held the papers and not because they had a rightful claim to the land. In summary, the history of the land ownership in the Philippines shows how colonial system took away the Filipinos' right to their own land. Agrarian reform goes beyond farming. It aims to correct long-standing injustice and return the land and dignity to Filipino farmers. Understand this history helps build a fairer and more productive farmer in agriculture. That's all. Thank you.
Well, good day, everyone. Today we're diving into a critical chapter of the Philippine history, the struggle for land ownership under the American colonial rule. So when the United States took control in 1898, they promised to fix the deep inequalities left by Spain. But the question was, did they succeed? Today my discussion will be to uncover how the reforms, despite the good intentions, often made things worse and why they still matter today. First, to set the stage, the Spanish colonial period left a brutal legacy. Vast haciendas owned by friars, landless peasants, and the encomienda system that tied farmers to the land like serfs. And by 1898, the United States inherited this power keg of inequality. They knew landlessness fueled revolutions like the 1896 Katipunan Uprising. So they vowed to modernize land ownership. But as we'll see, their policies had unintended consequences. Because here's the irony. The United States framed itself as a liberator, but its reforms often benefited elites, just like Spain's. So to break down their key policies, the Americans introduced three major policies. First is the Philippine Bill of 1902. This set rules for public land distribution. Individuals could own up to 16 hectares, while corporations could amass 1,024 hectares. So imagine that. A single corporation could own a town's worth of lands. To make things worse, this law allowed Americans to own Philippine agricultural land, a clear conflict of interest. Colonial officials and businessmen snapped up prime land and sidelining Filipinos. Next is the Land Registration Act of 1902, or Act number 496, introduced the Torrens system. On paper, this was progressive. It replaced chaotic Spanish records with standardized titles, but in practice, only the wealthy could afford the legal fees and surveys. The poor farmers were still left behind. And finally, the Homestead Program of 1903 promised 16-hectare plots to landless farmers. It sounds great, but there was a catch. It only applied to northern Luzon and Mindanao, areas where the United States struggled to control rebellions. This was not charity. It was a tactic to pacify resistance. So did these policies help the farmers? Not quite. Now we will look at the friar land controversies. So the friar lands were the crown jewel of Spanish oppression. Massive estates owned by the Catholic orders, worked by peasants as virtual slaves. The United States bought these lands, promising to redistribute them. But what happened? Instead of going to farmers, most were sold or leased to American Filipino elites. In Cavite, for example, friar lands became sugar plantations for the US companies. This betrayal fueled rage. Peasants saw the Americans as just new landlords in old robes. And of 166,000 hectares of friar lands, less than 10% went to small farmers. The rest were business interests. And again, protests erupted. So why the reforms failed? Let's diagnose why these reforms flopped. First, the Torrens system was rigged. Imagine a farmer who's tilled lands for generations but has no official title. To register, they need money for surveys, lawyers, and fees, which was impossible for most farmers. And meanwhile, the elites bought up untitled land for pennies, or for them spare change. Second, the Homestead Program offered land but not support. So there was land, but there were no loans for seeds, no tools, no protection from droughts. Many farmers ended up selling their plots to survive. And often, the very hacendados the US claimed to oppose. They sold their lands often to the very hacendados that the US claimed to oppose. And finally, the biggest flaw was no limit on land accumulation. Wealthy families like the Cojuangcos and Lopezes expanded their empires while tenants became more in debt. By 1935, tenancy rates rose from 50% to 70% in central Luzon. This wasn't reform. It was just legalized land grabbing. Next is the peasant unrest. So, as promises crumbled, peasants fought back. The Colorum Uprising of 1920s to the 1930s were millenarian movements. Farmers were practically praying for a messiah to overthrow the landlords. Then came the Sakdal Revolt of 1935, where 60,000 peasants stormed government offices shouting gahis na hindi na tayo aasa sa Amerika, or we're oppressed, we can't rely on America. These weren't random riots. They were desperate cries against a broken system, one that the Americans created. So to conclude, what's the legacy? The United States modernized land records but enriched inequality. Their reforms look progressive on paper but designed to fail for the poor. This isn't just history, it's why land reform is still unfinished today. The Hukbalahap Rebellion, Marcos land grabs, even CARP's struggles all trace us back to this era. So when we talk about colonial benevolence, remember that the US didn't end feudalism. They just rebranded it. Now, to reflect, could the US have done better? Maybe by capping land holdings or funding cooperatives, but ultimately, can a colonizer truly empower the colonized? That's just a question open for answers. So, that's all for my part of land ownership in the Philippines under the Americans.
Good day, everyone. I'm Lorraine T. Salvidad, and today I will be presenting the post-war interventions toward agrarian reform in the Philippines. This covers the key efforts of the presidents from Manuel Rojas, Elpidio Quirino, Ramon Magsaysay, and Justado Macapagal. These presidents laid the groundwork for land justice in a nation plagued by inequality, rural poverty, and landlord-tenants conflict. So after the World War II, the Philippines found itself in a deeply distressed state. The devastation from the war had left the country's economy shattered, with agriculture, that is its backbone, bearing the brunt of the damage. Fields were abandoned, infrastructures were destroyed, and rural families were displaced. So farmers and tenants, from the majority of whom relied on the land for survival, were trapped in an exploitative tenancy system, where the landlords claimed more than half of their harvest. This grim reality prompted a series of government-led agrarian reform initiatives aimed at addressing the rural inequality, restoring agriculture productivity, and ultimately reshaping the Philippine society. So we have here President Manuel Rojas, which and the foundation of the reform. So the very first post-war president is Manuel Rojas, which took early steps to address the land-related injustices in the Philippines. So in the year 1946, he introduced the Republic Act 34, a landmark attempt to rebalance the relationship between the landlord and tenant. So the Republic Act 34, enacted in 1946 during the early years of Philippines independence following the World War II. So this law was part of the broader attempt to rebuild the country and promote social justice, especially for the Filipino farmers who had long suffered from inequality, landlessness, and exploitation. So first of its system is what we call the 70-30 tenant landlord sharing system. So before this law, the sharing system was heavily um, skewed in favor of landlords, often giving tenants little to no control over their harvest. So the RA 34 changed this by mandating a 70-30 sharing ratio, where the tenants received 70% of the harvest and landlords took 30%. This was a major shift toward ensuring greater fairness and income for the Filipino farmers. It recognized their essential role in agricultural production and aimed to uplift their living conditions after the war. Second is the loan interest regulation, the 6% cap. So another critical provision was the limitation of the loan interest rates from the landlord to a maximum of 6%. So prior to this, many tenants were trapped in debt cycles due to a high interest on agricultural loans, often reaching exploitative levels. So by capping the interest, the RA 34 protected tenants from abusive lending practices, making it more feasible for them to recover economically and support their families. And the third is the redistribution of hacienda lands. The RA 34 also paved the way for the redistribution of large estates, or the haciendas, to landless farmers. This was part of a wider effort to break up monopolies held by powerful landowners who controlled vast amounts of land and wealth. So while implementation faced many challenges, this part of the law set the tone for future land reform policies with the goal of promoting social equality and reducing rural poverty. So, in summary, the Republic Act number 34 was a significant post-war agrarian reform initiative. It aims to create a more just agricultural system through a fair sharing system between tenants and landlords, regulation of exploitative interest rate, and efforts to redistribute land to the landless. Through challenges, though challenges remain in enforcement and resistance from the powerful landlords, the RA 34 marked an important first step in a long journey toward agrarian justice in the Philippines. And now, we already tackled the positive intentions and key reforms of the Republic Act number 34. And now let's take a look at the challenges and the limitations that hindered its full success and long-term impact. So while the RA 34 laid the groundwork for the agrarian reform, it was not without serious flaws. So now let's walk through the main problems that affected its implementation. So we have here the insufficient government funding. So first, the government lacked the financial resources to fully carry out the reforms. While the law sounded good on paper, budget constraints made implementation difficult. There wasn't enough support to ensure that the tenants and farmers could truly benefit from the law. Second is the lack to follow through mechanism. Another major issue was the absence of agencies or monitoring bodies. There were no dedicated institutions to oversee whether the landlords follow the 30-70 sharing rule or the 6% loan interest cap. This meant many provisions of the law were poorly enforced. Third is a resistance from landlord. So as expected, many powerful landlords were resistant to change. They saw the law as a threat to their wealth and power. So in response, many landowners block or delay reforms, using their influence to maintain control over their land and the tenants. And then fourth is the unproductive use of redistributed land. So even when land was distributed, it wasn't always used effectively. Why? That is because farmers lacked the necessary tools, equipment, and training to properly cultivate the land. This led to low productivity, and in some cases, the lands remain idle or underutilized. Fifth is the lack of implementation mechanism. So this ties in with the earlier points. There were no support system for the farmers, no access to education, credit, or modern equipment. So without this, even the land redistribution program could not succeed on its own. And then sixth is the weak political will. So lastly, the reform required strong political backing, but unfortunately, the government lacked the will to push through meaningful change. So leaders often hesitated to go against the powerful land elite, which slowed or stopped the progress. So to conclude, the RA 34 was a fundamental but flawed reform. It had noble goals and was a response to the urgent need for land reform after the war. However, its impact was limited by poor execution, lack of resources, and political resistance. But still, despite its shortcomings, the Republic Act 34 set the stage for future agrarian reform in the Philippines. It is the first step in a much longer and ongoing struggle for land justice. In the following years, after the World War II, the Philippines faced serious challenges in the rural development, landlessness, and poverty, especially in the countryside. One of the early government responses to these problems came under the leadership of President Elpidio Quirino through the establishment of the SIDICO, or the Land Settlement and Development Corporation. Now let's take a look on how this program shaped the early direction of the agrarian reform and the rural development. So we have here the establishment of the LACIDICO, the Land Settlement and Development Corporation, was created as a key agency to distribute public agricultural lands to landless families. The main goal was to provide new opportunities for farming and settlement, especially for those who had no access to land in their home provinces. The Lasidico became the government's primary vehicle for resettlement, aiming to improve the lives of the rural poor by giving them land to cultivate and a place to call home. Next is focused on the resettlement of landless peasants. One of the major functions of the Lasidico was the resettlement landless farmers, especially those from the overcrowded rural communities, and move them to less populated and agriculturally viable areas. This approach had a dual purposes, which is to decongest rural areas that were suffering from overpopulation and poverty, and to boost the agriculture productivity by transforming idle public lands into active farmlands. It was also an ambitious plan to balance social equality and economic recovery in the post era. Next is aim to provide opportunities for land cultivation and rural development. So beyond the relocation, the Lasidico also aimed to create a self-sustaining rural communities in which it provided support for settlers to become independent and productive farmers. So the government encouraged agriculture as a backbone of national recovery, and the Ladsidico helped plant the seeds for the vision by focusing on first, the land cultivation, the community building, empowerment of rural families, and then by the this reform under the President Elpidio Quirino represents one of the earliest and most organized attempt at rural development in post-war Philippines. So while it faced its own set of challenges later on, its efforts were an important step in giving landless Filipinos a chance at a better life through land opportunity and hope for the more productive future. To continue, it is important for us to recognize how these initial programs, although limited in scope, evolved and laid the groundwork for deeper, more impactful reforms in the years that followed. So, eventually evolved into a more extensive program. So, despite its noble vision, the Rasidico faced significant limitations as it lacked adequate support services such as education, irrigation, and credit access. So, it had a limited reach, failing to address the needs of all landless farmers across the country. But still, the experiences and lessons learned from Lasidico helped shape future strategies in agrarian reform. It became a stepping stone for the more organized and inclusive programs. And then eventually, the Lasidico was replaced by the NARA, which is the National Resettlement and Rehabilitation Administration, during the presidency of Ramon Magsaysay. Ramon Magsaysay is a leader deeply committed to social justice and rural empowerment. So under Magsaysay, the NARA expanded its mission, which is to enhance resettlement efforts. It integrated former Hawk rebels into peaceful agricultural life. It promoted rural peace and stability by addressing poverty and landlessness, which is the two major causes of unrest. And then the Lacidicus role as a key early step. So this Lacidico may not have achieved all its goal, but it was an important starting point. It represents the government's early effort to address land inequality and uplift the rural poor after the devastation of the war. So, although limited in execution, the Lasidico served as a blueprint, a model that inspired larger scale, more effective reforms under future administration, especially that the President Ramon Magsaysay. Its legacy reminds us that even the most modest beginning can pave the way for transformative change in the lives of Filipino farmers. And then, now, let's move forward to the crucial turning point in the Philippine agrarian history, which is the administration of President Ramon Magsaysay, often remembered as a champion of the common man. So, under his leadership, agrarian reform efforts expanded significantly, not only to address poverty, but also to improve peace and stability in the countryside. So, first is the creation of NARA, or the National Resettlement and Rehabilitation Administration. One of Magsaysay's landmark reform was the strengthening and formal creation of NARA. The NARA was designed to replace the LACIDICO, which had limited reach and impact. So this accelerated the resettlement of landless farmers and former Huklahab rebels, many of whom had taken up arms due to extreme poverty and land injusticeness. So through this program, Magsaysay offered both groups a second chance, this time through peaceful agricultural life, which aim was to convert unrest into productivity and to help rebuild rural communities. Next is promoted public land redistribution and settler support. President Magsaysay understood that giving land was not enough, but needs support must follow. So under the NARA, the government redistributed public land and provided essential support for new settlers such as basic housing, farming tools and seeds, technical guidance and agricultural training, and this holistic approach allowed settlers to establish productive communities, breaking the cycle of poverty and encouraging long-term stability in rural areas. And then next is the Republic Act number 1199, the Agricultural Tenancy Act of 1954. This is another major contribution during the Magsaysay's time was the passage of this Republic Act, or also known as the Agricultural Tenancy Act of 1954. This law was a milestone for tenant right as it clearly defined the rules and responsibilities of tenants and landowners, formalized tenancy agreements, which requiring written contracts, protected tenant farmers from unjust eviction, and encouraged fairer rental arrangements and improved security of land tenures. This act gave tenant farmers the legal tools to stand on more equal footing with landlords, promoting justice and dignity in the agricultural sectors. So through President Ramon Magsaysay agrarian reform, expansion marked a significant step forward, and his administration not only advanced land distribution but also focused on empowering farmers, rehabilitating former rebels, and promoting peace through justice. Magsaysay's legacy reminds us that real reform happens when leaders listen to the people, especially the poor, and take concrete actions to uplift their lives. And then now, we've explored the land distribution efforts and the role of the President Ramon Magsaysay in expanding agrarian reform. And now let's move on to the legal and institutional foundations that were built to support farmers and make reform sustainable. This agrarian reform focused not just on land but also on rights, access to justice, and financial stability for rural communities. First is the tenurial rights. One of the most important legal protections introduced during this time was the strengthening of tenurial rights. This meant that tenant farmers could no longer be evicted without just legal cause. The tenancy agreements were required to be in writing and legally enforceable. This shift brought a greater sense of security to farmers and promoted fairness and trust between landowners and the tenants. This is a big step forward in professionalizing agriculture and protecting the rural poor. Next is the Court of Agriculture Relations, which is in 1955. To resolve the many disputes that often arose between landlords and tenants, the government established a special court, the Court of Agricultural Relations in 1955. This court was dedicated to handling cases related to tenancy conflicts, rental disputes, and other agrarian issues. With the institution in place, farmers were finally given direct access to legal justice, which had previously been difficult or impossible in many rural areas. Next is the Agricultural Tenancy Commission. The Agricultural Tenancy Commission was also created to monitor the implementation of tenancy laws and to enforce fair practices. This ensured that the landlords follow legal guidelines, tenants receive proper protection, and conflicts were addressed with accountability. This helps maintain peace and legal order in rural communities, giving more structure to agrarian reform implementation. Next is the ACCFA, or the Agricultural Credit and Cooperative Financing Administration. So, of course, land reform also needed economic support system. The ACCFA, or the Agriculture Credit and Cooperative Financing Administration, was created to provide affordable credit, connect farmers to markets, and offer warehouse services for crop storage. This allows farmers to first avoid predatory lending, get fair prices for their products, strengthen agricultural cooperatives for collective success, and it was a game changer to establishing a rural economy. And then next is the Agricultural and Industrial Bank. So the government established the Agricultural and Industrial Bank to help farmers purchase land and improve their farms. This bank offered low interest loan tailored for agricultural needs, which engage the land ownership, investment in better tools and equipment, and overall growth of the farming sector. So, by these legal protections and institutional support, this is a very crucial in sustaining the agrarian reforms beyond just land distribution. These help protect farmers' rights, resolve conflict, and provide the financial means to grow and improve their livelihoods. So, by these initiatives, it helps move the Philippine agricultural from a survival to stability and dignity, which empowering farmers to be active contributors to the nation's progress. But then, let's look at the realistic and long-term impact of agrarian reform efforts during the President Ramon Magsaysay administration. So while many of these were visionary and progressive, they also faced serious challenges that affected the full implementation of the reform. So the limitations include the inadequate government funding. So despite the bold effort and good intentions, several key limitations prevented the agrarian reform program from reaching its full potential. So as what I've said, first inadequate government funding. So the government lacked enough financial resources to support all resettlement efforts, infrastructure needs, and support services. This leads to slow implementation and uneven coverage across the country. Next is resistance from wealthy landowners. Many powerful landowners oppose the reforms. Some refuse to cooperate, while others use legal loopholes or political influence to delay or weaken the enforcement. Limited access to tools and training. So while land was distributed, many beneficiaries didn't have the farming equipment or agricultural knowledge they needed. So without proper support, some farmers struggles to make the land productive. So all of these limitations hindered the full success of the agrarian reforms program. So to conclude, despite the challenges, President Ramon Magsaysay reform were a bold and comprehensive attempt to address one of the Philippines' most deeply rooted issues, which is the land inequality. So his approach, which is to combine, is the land distribution, peaceful through resettlement, and strong legal and institutional support. So while the reforms were not perfect, they paved the way for future agrarian reform policies and helped establish stronger legal and economic foundations for the Filipino farmers. So most importantly, Magsaysay's legacy lives as a role model for leadership grounded in justice, equality, and compassion for the poor. Now, let's talk about the another major milestone in the Philippine agrarian reform, which is the Agricultural Land Reform Code of 1963, or also known as Republic Act 3844, which signed into law by the President Justado Macapagal. This was a landmark agrarian reform law that aimed to address the deeply rooted issues of land inequality and farmer exploitation. So President Macapagal understood that one of the biggest barriers to rural development was the shared tenancy system, where tenant farmers gave a large portion of their harvest to landlords, often leaving them in poverty and dependence. So with the RA 3844, the government made a bold move. It aimed to abolish this exploitative shared tenancy system and lay down the foundation for long-term rural development and social justice. So the main goal of the RA 44 is to abolish the shared tenancy system. It is also to replace the shared tenancy with a leasehold arrangement. So instead of giving a percentage of their crops to landlords, farmers would now pay a fixed rent, giving them more control over their earnings and harvest. So this helped reduce exploitation and promote fairness in landlord-tenant relationship. This also promote owner cultivatorship and family seized farms. This is the another key objectives of the RA 3844, which is to encourage the transfer of the land to those who actually tilt it. So the goal of this is to turn tenants into independent landowners, managing family-sized farms that they could call their own. So this move aimed to boost motivation, productivity, and self-sufficiency among the farmers. So now let's discuss the essential policy for the development of the agricultural sector in the Philippines, which is the declaration of the policy under the Agricultural Land Reform Code, especially the Section 2 of the Republic Act number 3844. This policy aimed to establish the foundation for a just and productive agricultural system with the um, overarching goal of uplifting the lives of small farmers and transforming the agricultural landscape into a thriving self-sufficient sector. So the purpose of this policy is that to create an agricultural system that benefits the small farmers, promoting equity and productivity while reducing dependence on exploitative landlord-tenant relationships. Now, let's break down the key elements of this declaration. So, first is the establishment of the owner cultivatorship and economic family size. So, um, this state aimed to promote owner cultivatorship, where the farmers own the land they work on, ensuring that they directly benefit from their labor. This initiative is a crucial part of the policy, as it shifts away from the traditional landlord system. The concept of economic family-sized farms is also emphasized, which refers to farms that are manageable and sustainable for a family, which fostering a better land stewardship and productivity. So the division of the landlord capital into industrial development. So in line with the policy, the government seek to redirect landlord capital investment in agriculture toward industrial development. This would not only reduce land concentration in the hands of a few landlords, but also stimulate growth in other sectors of the economy, particularly industry, which is vital for long-term economic development. The dignified Next is to achieve dignified existence for our small farmers free from pernicious institutional restraints um, and practices. So, this is to address that such exploitation by landlords on insufficient land tenure security. So the small farmers are at the heart of this reform, and by giving them more control over the land and livelihood, the state hope to lift them out of the poverty and ensure they can live with dignity. And then next is the creation of viable social and economic structure. So this policy also seeks to create a social and economic structure that is truly viable and productive, conducive to a greater farm productivity and higher farm incomes. So by focusing on small farmers, the government intends to foster a system where agricultural productivity is enhanced, leading to increased income and better living standards for rural families. Next is equal application of labor laws. So another major elements is the application of the labor laws, which equally to all farmers, both in industrial and agricultural sectors. This ensures that agricultural workers are not subjected to discriminatory treatment and are afforded the same labor protections and benefits as their industrial counterparts. And then next is the land resettlement and distribution program. The policy also highlights the importance of a vigorous and systematic land resettlement program. This program is intended to ensure that the landless farmers have access to land, facilitating public land distribution to those in need. In this part of the policy is critical for addressing landlessness, which has been a long-standing issue in the Philippines. The declaration of the policy under RA 3844, Section 2, is designated to transform Philippine agriculture into a more just and productive system by focusing on the small farmers and the principles of land reform. It aims to create a more equitable society where the economic and social structures in agriculture benefit those who work the land. This policy not only addresses the immediate needs of farmers, but also envision long-term economic and social transformation that will enhance the lives of a small farmers, contribute to industrial growth, and strengthen the nation's democracy. So that is the policy under the law. And this is the policy under the law. And then now we have here the impact, significant, and limitations of the Republic Act number 3844 or the Agricultural Land Reform Code. So this law represents a critical step toward transforming the agricultural sector in the Philippines. But like any legislation, it has its achievements and challenges. Now let's tackle the significance of the RA 3844. So one of the most comprehensive agrarian reform laws in the Philippines history is the 3844 stand out as one of the most comprehensive agrarian reform law in the country's history. Its scope and depth reflect a bold attempt by the government to address the long-standing issues of land inequality, exploitation of farmers, and rural poverty. The law's provision focus not only on land distribution but also on social justice, labor rights, and economic independence, making it a landmark piece of the legislation. Next is promoted fairness, independence, and rural development. The significance of the R3844 lies in its role in promoting fairness in the agricultural sector. By shifting toward owner cultivatorship and providing legal protection for the small farmers, it would work toward equalizing the land ownership and empowering farmers. The law also aimed at rural development by encouraging the creation of family sized farms and improving the overall productivity of the agricultural sector. Through land redistribution and labor law protections, it promoted a more equitable society where small farmers could thrive. Then, next, it empowered the small farmers through ownership and legal protection. So, perhaps the most effective A impactful element of RA 3844 is its focus on empowering small farmers by informing land ownership and providing legal protection for their rights. Before this law, small farmers were often subject to exploitative practices by landlords. Through land redistribution and the establishment of owner cultivatorship, farmers gained control over their land and livelihoods, which allowed them to live more dignified lives and break free from cycles of poverty. So, overall, the impact of the RA 34 is evident in a way it reshaped the Philippine agriculture. Although its full potential is still unfolding, the low the lost land distribution programs have resulted in the redistribution of millions of hectares of land to small farmers. This emphasis on land reform and farm ownership significantly improved the security and livelihoods of those involved in the agriculture. Additionally, the implementation of labor laws in the agricultural sector improved the conditions for farm workers, granting them access to rights previously afforded only to industrial workers. This program for resettlement and public land redistribution helped address the issues of landlessness and public land redistribution addressed among the rural families, promoting stability in rural areas. However, despite this advantage, the law also have a flaws or face many challenges which will be discussed. So the here is the challenges and the limitations of the RA 3844. So, first challenges is the poor implementation due to limited government funding, which is ibalik-balik na siya ganina, because it is have inadequate funding for the land redistribution, resettlement program, and the creation of the sustainable program. So, without the necessary financial resources, many aspects of the law remain stale or poorly executed, leaving many small farmers without the support they needed for fully benefit from the reforms. And then next is lack of the political will, especially from Congress dominated by landlords. And many reform remained on paper and were not fully enforced. So this as the result of this, many farmers were left without the land or support promised to them by the law, and the unequal distribution of land persisted in many regions. So, to conclude, the RA 3844 was a strong legal foundation for agrarian reform, while its vision remains ambiguous and empowering the real change was limited by elite resistance and poor enforcement. So to wrap up this reporting is we have here the key takeaways in which the post-war reforms aim to address historical land injusticeness and the legal protection, which is the RA 1199, RA 3844 supported tenants and the land redistribution, and the implementation was weak due to elite resistance and limited funding, and these reforms laid the groundwork for future agrarian reform. So, um, and these reforms um, reminds us that true land justice requires not only strong laws but also genuine political will and support for our farmers. So that wrap up the um, topic about the post-war interventions toward the agrarian reforms in the Philippines.
Good day, everyone. Today, we will talk about the agrarian reform efforts under the administration of our former President Ferdinand Marcos. So, this presentation is a historical perspective on land redistribution in the Philippines. Talking about the reform, this was among the most ambitious attempts in Philippine history to address land inequality, rural poverty, and social injustice. So, by understanding the impact, the goals, and implementations of these reform, we could gain valuable insights into the complexities of agrarian reform and its role in shaping the lives of the Filipino farmers. So, what is Agrarian Reform Program? So, the Agrarian Reform Program, or ARP in the Philippines, has been a cornerstone of efforts to address socio-economic inequality in rural areas, and it has been a central issue in the Philippines as a large portion of the rural population has historically lacked access to land ownership. During Marcos' administration, the issue gained national prominence through agrarian reform program which aimed to address landlessness among farmers and promote social justice. However, these reforms were not just about redistributing land, they were also about empowering the peasant sector, boosting agricultural productivity, and alleviating rural poverty. In this presentation, we'll explore the key elements of these reforms, their implementation, and their lasting legacy. Now, let us take a look on the history of agrarian reform under Marcos. So, in 1972, President Ferdinand Marcos initiated a far reaching agrarian reform in Philippine history through the Presidential Decree number 27. So, what is Presidential Decree number 27? So, this decree targeted tenant farmers working on rice and corn lands, granting them the right to own the land they tilled. So the program's goal was to promote social justice and rural development by addressing the root cause of poverty in rural areas. So the unequal and Ferdinand Marcos believed that the root cause of poverty was the unequal distribution of land. So the agrarian reform under Marcos was aimed to give our Filipino farmers the right to own their land that they tilled. So the agrarian reform efforts under Marcos has several key features, and one of that is the land distribution. So tenant farmers were granted ownership of a family-sized farms, and for irrigated land, the maximum size was 3 hectares, and for non-irrigated land, the maximum size was 5 hectares. And landowners could also retain 7 hectares if they cultivated the land themselves. So that is for the land distribution. And who are the beneficiaries of this land distribution? So the reform targeted tenant farmers, farm workers, and agricultural laborers. Next is the support services. So, to ensure farmers could make productive use of the land, the government provided support services such as access to credit, training, and infrastructure. Programs like Operation Land Transfer and Masagana 99. It aimed to assist farmers in achieving rice self sufficiency. Lastly is the Land Bank of the Philippines. So this institution played a crucial role by financing the program, providing compensation to owners and offering loans to farmers to improve their operations. So that's it for the key features of the reform program. Now let's move on with the implementation. While the agrarian reform efforts under Marcos had ambitious goals, it was fraught with challenges. First challenge is the resistance from large landowners. So many large landowners were unwilling to give up their land, and the uban resort into legal and political maneuvers, delaying the redistribution. So dili sila musugot nga nung ihatag man ang mga yuta. So di ba, ana ang nahitabo during the implementation. Next is the limited scope. Limited scopes here because as we have discussed a while ago, the agrarian reform efforts was focused lang sa mga rice and corn lands, while gi-exclude diri ang plantation and commercial farms nga mo ni sila ang ga-dominate sa agricultural landscape. Next is the slow progress. Why? Because the bureaucratic inefficiencies and corruption further slowed the process, leaving many farmers waiting for years to receive the land ownership. So, na-implement ang agrarian reform, dugay pa dayon ay na dawat sa mga tenant farmers, mga farm workers, agricultural laborers, ang land nga para sa ilaha tungod lagi atong slow nga progress because of the bureaucratic inefficiencies. So these challenges made it difficult for the program to achieve its intended goals. So that is for the challenges during the implementation. Now let's move on with the challenges faced in general. So, in general, ng mga challenges na na-faced sa agrarian reform program. So, first in here is the implementation delays. So, I have mentioned this already because the land redistribution was slow, inefficient, leaving many farmers landless for extended periods. Next is weak enforcement. So, weak enforcement. Why? Because some landlords found ways to evade the reforms, such as shifting to crops like coconuts and sugar, which were exempted, or evicting tenant farmers altogether. Next is the inadequate support system. Na-mention ba ko ni sa mga key features ganiya sa reform. Though it is one of its key features, inadequate siya. Why? Because while land ownership was granted, many farmers lacked the tools, training, and financial support to make their land productive. So daghan mga farmers gyapon nga wala nakadawat ato nga support services. Next is the exclusion of landless peasants. Unsa man ni siya? The program mainly benefited tenant farmers, leaving out many landless agricultural laborers who were equally in need. So naay mga na-exclude. So ang focus lang gid kayo ani nga program was the farmers sa rice and sa mga cornlands. And na-exclude do mga agricultural laborers who were equally in need gyapon of land. So these issues revealed systematic flaws in the program and its inability to fully address rural inequality. Moving on, the result of the agrarian reform efforts under Marcos were mixed. There were positive outcomes and ongoing challenges. For example, the land distribution. So some tenant farmers gained ownership of land, and programs like Wasagana 99 provided access to credit and agricultural inputs. While sa ongoing challenge naman ani, though so naana naka-acquire sila og land, but the many farmers struggled with low productivity due to a lack of support system or resources and support. Ako ni na-mention po, di ba ganiha? In areas with large plantation estates and ownership, inequality remained largely unchanged. So while the program fell short of its goals, it was significant in starting conversations about land reform and rural development in the Philippines. Now let's talk about the legacy of Marcos Agrarian Reform. So the legacy of Marcos Agrarian Reform was complex. Why? Because on one hand, it laid the groundwork for future agrarian reform programs and brought attention to the issue of rural poverty. On the other hand, naman, it highlighted the difficulties of implementing meaningful reforms in a system dominated by powerful elites. No? So, makita na to nga, though it laid a groundwork for future nga agrarian reform programs and brought attention to kanang issue nga rural poverty, land inequality. On the other hand naman, it highlighted kung unsa gid ay kalisod ang mag-implement og meaningful reforms in a system nga dominated sa mga powerful elites and walay plano nga i-address ni nga issue. So the program demonstrated that land reform requires not just redistribution, but also strong political will, effective enforcement, and sustained support for farmers to ensure lasting change. In conclusion, the agrarian reform program under Marcos was ambitious in its vision but faced challenges, numerous challenges in execution. It aimed to empower tenant farmers and address rural poverty, but resistance from landowners weak enforcement and limited resources undermined its success. So, despite its shortcoming naman, the program remains a significant chapter in Philippine history, shaping the course of land reform policies in the years that followed. So, it serves as a reminder that meaningful reform requires a combination of strong leadership, practical support, and commitment to social justice. That is it for my part. Thank you for listening. Now I'll give the time to my other groupmate for the next topic.
So, good day everyone. I'm Ariana Faisa Sisay, and today I'll be talking all about Carper and the future of agrarian reform in the Philippines. So, before we move on to knowing all about Carper, so let's know first about the historical context of agrarian reforms in the Philippines. So, agrarian reform in the Philippines has deep roots tracing back to the Spanish colonial period when land was mostly owned by a few powerful elites. So, land ownership was highly unequal since the Spanish colonial era. So, to correct this injustice, President Corazon Aquino implemented the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, or CARP, in 1988 to redistribute land to landless farmers. So the CARP's main goal was to give agricultural land to landless farmers and promote fairness in rural communities. So now let's talk about the birth of Carper. So after the original Carp expired in 2008, there were still 1.2 million farmers who hadn't received land, and 1.6 million hectares remained undistributed. So, to respond to this, President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo signed Republic Act 9700 in 2009. So, this law is more commonly known as CARPER, or the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program extension with reform. So, Carper is like an extension to CARP. So, Carper gave the government 5 more years to complete the land distribution process, extending the deadline to June 30, 2014 instead of 2008. So, an important feature of this law is found in Section 30, which states that even if a case or proceeding related to CARP is still pending by that date, it can continue and be resolved even beyond the deadline. So, this provision helped ensure the unresolved agrarian reform efforts wouldn't just be forgotten after the cutoff. So, next, let's talk about the implementation data and limit and efforts. So from 2009 to 2014, Carper successfully redistributed about 1 million hectares of agricultural land to roughly 900,000 farmer beneficiaries. While this was a significant milestone, it still left around 500,000 hectares of land undistributed despite 27 years of reform under two Aquino presidencies. So, the Department of Agrarian Reform, or DAR, and the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DENR, were the main agencies responsible for implementation. However, even with their combined authority and resources, they fell short of meeting the full goals of agrarian reform. So, persistent administrative inefficiencies and interference from powerful political actors exposed the weaknesses of the institutions tasked to deliver land justice. So these challenges made it clear that stronger institutional mechanisms and genuine political will are necessary to fully realize agrarian reform in the Philippines. So, of course, this law has its challenges, no, and limitations. So let's talk further about that in the next slide. So now we will talk about the challenges even more. So Carper, much like the original carp, was hindered by several serious challenges that ultimately limited its success. So one major obstacle was the continued resistance from powerful landowners who used legal loopholes and political influence to delay or avoid land redistribution. On top of that, bureaucratic inefficiency from the implementing agencies, the DAR and DENR, resulted in administrative backlogs and unclear process. So even when land was successfully distributed, many beneficiaries lacked the necessary post-distribution support such as credit, farm tools, or market access. Over time, due to persistent poverty and inadequate livelihood opportunities, some farmers ended up selling or leasing their awarded lands, causing a dangerous trend of land consolidation. So these issues show that land ownership alone is not enough. Comprehensive and sustained support systems are necessary for agrarian reform to truly empower farmers and transform rural lives. So next, so we'll talk now about the future of agrarian reform in the Philippines. So even after the expiration of Carper in 2014, agrarian reform in the Philippines remains at work in progress. So the fact that many lands remain undistributed and numerous farmers continue to lack adequate support shows that the battle for land justice is far from over. So, moving forward, agrarian reform must not be limited to land distribution alone. It should adopt a more comprehensive and sustainable approach to rural development. So, this means enacting new laws to safeguard land rights, ensuring continuous access to cultural support services, and improving the capabilities of implementing institutions. Additionally, systemic issues such as the influence of the land elite must be addressed. Grassroots organizations must be empowered to take part in shaping policies, and above all, genuine political will is essential. Without it, true reform will remain elusive, and Filipino farmers will continue their long standing fight for their rightful place on the land they till. So, to conclude it all, we can the viewers can read this, but I will shorten it. So to conclude, while carp and carper made significant progress, true agrarian reform in the Philippines remains unfinished. So land distribution alone is really not enough. Based from what I've said all this time, it land distribution alone is not enough. We need stronger laws, better support for farmers, and real political will to address the deep-rooted issues in the system. So only then we can achieve genuine land justice for the Filipino farmers who have long fought for their right to own the land they till. So I think that is all for my report. My report is just short. It's just this. So that is all. Thank you.